The Nintendo Switch brought many indie games to new audiences. Some older titles that may have only been available on PC, or smaller studio games that went under the radar on other consoles. A genre that's become very popular is the roguelike, and its younger sibling, the rogue-lite. But what's the difference between the two? Why are they rogue anything? Where does the rogue part come from? Turns out there's a very large rabbit hole that I fell down when trying to find the answers to these questions. Let's start with the name. Why rogue? Way back in 1980, Rogue, Exploring the Dungeons of Doom, was a text-based dungeon crawler, developed by AI Design and published by Epix. The levels and items were randomly generated, which back then was a fairly new concept in video games. Players would explore a dungeon, and if the character lost all their health, there would be permadeath. This meant the player would have to start the game from scratch after each defeat. No items or skills carried over, no save states or loading files. The combat was turn-based and the movement grid-based. Players would only be able to progress by improving their real-life skills, such as deciding which rooms to explore or how quickly they want to move on to the next dungeon. This sounds stupidly hard by today's standards, but the appeal of giving a run one more go, or seeing how far you could get the next time, was and still is what makes the difficulty kind of addictive. After the success of Rogue, two notable games appeared which included elements from Rogue, but made some small changes. Hack was developed in 1982 by Jay Fenleyson with help from his friends. It was a small high school project that evolved into Nethack in 1987. This was still based on Rogue, but introduced a wider variety of monsters, had predefined levels, multiple routes through the dungeons, and even character-based quests that led the player towards a powerful item that they could use to complete the game. Moria was developed in 1983 by Robert Allen Koernke, and added a town where players could buy and sell items outside of the dungeons. These changes seemed small but were significant, and inspired others to see what elements they could implement into their own games. In 1993, Japanese audiences were more console-driven, so Chunsoft wanted to build on their success with the Dragon Quest series by making a console version of the highly popular dungeon crawlers that Westerners only played on home computers. This led to the creation of mystery dungeon games. Torneko's Great Adventure Mystery Dungeon was released in 1993 and created a new series of dungeon-based games. All the exploration and combat of Rogue, but with progressive difficulty the further into the game a player went, and permadeath being optional with difficulty settings. Another game called Linley's Dungeon Crawl was created in 1995 by Linley Hensel, who introduced what is now seen as a fundamental element in many roguelikes, a skill-based character system based on assigning points to improve a character's weapon proficiency, attributes, or other abilities. So why aren't we calling games Moria-likes or Hack-likes? It honestly just came down to Rogue, as it was the oldest of the group of games. So Rogue had inspired other games to use some of its elements, while changing or adding different mechanics or areas. But what do you call a game that's like Rogue, shares parts of Rogue, but isn't Rogue? Well, it's a roguelike. But how can you tell if a game is a roguelike or a dungeon crawler? What puts a game into this category? In 2008, there was a conference in Berlin where a list of high and low value factors were used in order to determine if a game would fit into this new genre. There were 60 points to gain when assessing a game, and the higher the score, the more roguelike it was. The high value factors were: random dungeon generation, no two levels are the same, and no items are in the same place. Permadeath. If a character runs out of health, the player must start the game from the beginning with no items or progression from the previous playthrough. Turn-based combat. Pausing to allow players to make choices on how to progress in combat. Non-modal. No actions are locked for the player, and everything is available from the start. Different systems in place for the player to have choices on how to move forwards. If you reach a locked door, players could pick the lock, break the door, or find a key. Resource management to survive. Using potions to buff stats, or food to generate health. Hack and slash gameplay. Unlike modern action games, where it just means press a button and hit things, hack and slash meant combat using swords and having to defeat as many monsters as possible. Exploration that changes with every playthrough. Keeping the dungeons random with every run enabled replayability. Low value factors, or factors that didn't need to be in the game specifically, are controlling a single character in one playthrough. Monsters and characters have identical behaviours in combat. Tactical and survival elements. Tile-based map and ASCII characters. Dungeons that have rooms with connecting corridors. And the status of the game and player are shown on the UI. With the roguelike firmly cemented into the gaming world as a genre, with all the factors and elements needed to classify games, a new subgenre was slowly coming into view. Roguelikes were sometimes considered too difficult to be generally popular, or dungeon crawlers were falling out of style. So around the year 2000, developers began to take elements of roguelike games and simplify or adjust them in new and different ways. The permadeath aspect of roguelikes was changed so that the same character could restart a level, while retaining items and skills from previous playthroughs. New players would be offered help in games, such as tutorials, allowing more people access to what was once a hugely difficult genre. Tile-based movement and turn-based combat were replaced with free movement and action-based combat. Every level was short, making them not as overwhelming as roguelikes, and making players feel they could play in bursts to finish a game rather than hours. Skills, characters, or items could be unlocked between levels, and procedural generation would scale in difficulty with the player's skill. Well, this new subgenre was roguelike, but not quite. What would it be called? The term roguelike-like was initially used, which was pretty accurate, but a better name would become popular: rogue-lite. Developers of rogue-lites had more freedom to pick and choose which elements they wanted in their game and how they wanted to use them. They wouldn't be held to a strict set of rules, nor a requirement to set their game in a dungeon or fantasy world. Games like Rogue Legacy, Children of Morta, and Curse of the Dead Gods would all be considered roguelites due to the carryover of skills and sometimes items earned in playthroughs. Rogue Legacy begins every game by asking the player to choose their heir. There's a choice of 3 characters, each with different attributes or quirks, such as vertigo, which flips the screen, or glaucoma, which adds a black fuzz. Any upgrades from previous playthroughs are passed on down the lineage, and a blacksmith, enchantress, and architect can be unlocked permanently. The player can spend coins earned in the castle on improving stats or gear, but has to give up all remaining coins in order to enter the castle. The player can then fight their way through the randomly generated levels, defeating enemies and collecting coins. Once the character loses all health, the player is taken back to the main screen, asked to choose their heir, and the cycle continues. Children of Morta focuses on the Bergson family and their dungeon-crawling adventures. The player has a choice of the 7 family members, all of whom have different combat styles and abilities. Not all family members are unlocked at the beginning though. Each character will level up individually and can unlock upgrades that benefit other family members. The dungeons are procedurally generated with story-specific areas appearing in certain levels. Again, once the chosen character loses all health, the player is taken back to the family home, where story elements can be explored. Or upgrades can be purchased using treasure collected in dungeons. To progress, the player chooses a character and continues the dungeon runs, using the upgrades and abilities learned to get a little further. Curse of the Dead Gods puts a twist on the gameplay by adding curses or challenging status effects at the beginning of each level when the curse meter is full. Each curse is random and there's a wide variety. You could be cursed with having hallucinations when damage is taken. Health drops over time until your health meter reaches 1 point. Or you lose the same amount of health as you do gold when you're attacked. There's only one character to play, and multiple routes to pick to get to the end level boss. Light and dark also modify the gameplay by attack stats being raised when fighting in a lit area, and darkness lowering attack. There are fountains and shrines to buy buffs or abilities to help get the player through the dungeon, as well as healing fountains. These buffs will only be active during the current run though. Coins are currency, as is sacrificing the curse meter. Spending a certain amount will increase the amount of curse in the meter. Once the character loses all health, he's taken to the underworld, where the player can spend currencies on blessings or buffs to get an extra edge on the next run. So after all that, how can you tell the difference between roguelike and rogue-lite when you see a game in the wild? If you have to restart a game as if it was the very first time, every time you get a game over, it's most likely a roguelike. If you can buy skills and items and keep them when you get a game over, most likely a roguelite. This isn't the ultimate rulebook, of course, just the most simplified way I can think of distinguishing the two, as it can get confusing. It also shouldn't matter which you prefer playing either. One isn't easier than the other. It's apples and oranges. Different, but still fruit. So, when someone asks you, why is a game called a roguelike? Or what's the difference between like and light? You can think back to 1980, when a little game called Rogue was made, and ended up creating huge waves in modern gaming.